In 1982, a debt crisis struck Mexico and Argentina. To most observers, the development came as something of a surprise. At the time, it was widely held that countries couldn't go bankrupt. They could always raise more tax revenue and pay off creditors, so states were thought to be a safe investment. In 1982, we learned that this isn't necessarily the case. Since then, a series of financial crises in Russia, Thailand, Mexico, and more recently in Greece, Iceland, and elsewhere have cast doubt on the financial solvency of states around the world. Today we'll explore how this came to be. At the end of World War II, the global economy faced something of a conundrum. Historically, most currencies had been backed by gold. This provided a mechanism through which countries could settle balance of trade and balance of payments issues. When a country ran a trade deficit, they could settle that deficit by transferring gold to another country. Remember that balance of trade refers to the difference between the cost of a country's exports and the cost of its imports. A negative balance of trade is referred to as a trade deficit. Balance of payments includes balance of trade, but also includes other capital transfers, including debt payments. By definition, balance of payments for each country must equal zero. If a country is importing more than it exports, for example, the difference must be financed in other ways, such as receiving loans from other countries or by spending down central bank reserves. The problem the world faced at the end of World War II, though, was that the United States held about 70% of the global gold reserves, making it virtually impossible for other leading economies to back their currencies with gold. The solution that was reached under the Bretton Woods system was the dollar standard. The United States would peg its dollar to gold at a value of $35 an ounce. Other countries could then back their currency with US dollars, effectively making the US dollar the world's reserve currency. The system worked reasonably well in its early years, as US allies were generally willing to hold US dollars. However, the system increasingly came under stress as US gold reserves declined. In 1945, the United States held about $24 billion in gold reserves. However, continuous balance of payments deficits throughout the 1950s caused a buildup of dollar reserves in the central banks of Europe and Japan. These central banks redeemed their dollars for gold, and as a result, US gold reserves declined precipitously. By the late 1960s, the United States had just $12 billion in gold reserves, only enough to cover about 5% of its total dollar obligations. The US government took several steps to try and reduce its balance of payments problems. In the early 1960s, for example, it tried tying foreign aid to the purchase of US products and imposed new taxes on capital controls on US citizens. However, these measures had little impact and were particularly blunted by massive US military spending abroad, particularly in Vietnam, and on the growing trade deficit. As a result, in 1968, the United States stopped redeeming privately held dollars for gold, and 3 years later, in 1971, President Richard Nixon removed the US dollar from the gold standard altogether. From now on, the value of the US dollar would be determined by the market, that is, by what buyers were willing to pay for a dollar, rather than by the price of gold. Shortly after the shift to the floating dollar, the first OPEC oil embargo was launched in 1973. The embargo drove oil prices sharply higher, virtually doubling overnight. A second oil embargo in 1979 similarly drove prices higher, as the graph here suggests. Higher oil prices had two important impacts on developing countries in general and on the debt crisis in particular. Oil exporting countries were suddenly awash in US dollars. Remember that oil has historically been priced in US dollars. This means that a country wanting to purchase oil on global markets must first purchase dollars on global markets. Oil exporting countries deposited their new reserves into Western banks. And because banks make money not on deposits but on loans, they were desperate to find new borrowers to whom billions of petrodollars could be lent. At the same time, non-oil exporting countries faced a real challenge. Not only was the price of oil increasing, but bilateral aid was declining and populations were growing. They needed a way to find they needed to find a way to pay for government programs, development projects, and imports from abroad. The cheap cost of credit made borrowing an attractive solution in the 1970s, particularly for states. Remember that states were seen as safe investments. At the time, it was widely held that states could not go bankrupt. Real interest rates, that is, the interest rate minus the rate of inflation, were often negative, meaning the countries could repay loans using cheaper dollars than they borrowed, effectively subsidizing the cost of credit. And so they borrowed. Some countries borrowed for good reasons, such as to expand oil production or develop infrastructure to support broader economic diversification. Other countries borrowed just to make ends meet. But regardless of the purpose of borrowing, an interesting dual dependency emerged. Both borrowers, the states, and their creditors, the banks, were dependent on this flow of dollars. The system worked reasonably well in the short run, but by the late 1970s, a global economic crisis was emerging. The United States economy was entering a period of stagflation, that is, a situation which combines high rates of unemployment and high rates of inflation. But the economic models available at the time suggested the two could not go together. Embodied in the Phillips curve, it was widely held that as the rate of inflation increased, the rate of unemployment would decrease, and vice versa. This provided an important policy tool. If the government was concerned about inflation running out of control, it could always squeeze the economy, driving up the unemployment rate but bringing inflation back under control. But in the late 1970s, something strange happened. Inflation and unemployment were increasing at the same time. The traditional policy tools available to the government were incapable of addressing the situation. From a policy perspective, the solution was a difficult one. Paul Volcker, chair of the Federal Reserve Bank, would sharply increase interest rates, ending the problem of inflation but driving up the unemployment rate. The Fed, in other words, would start a recession. The Volcker shock had a dramatic effect on the United States and the global economy more broadly. By increasing the interest rates and introducing contractionary policy in the United States, Volcker unintentionally caused a sharp increase in the price of the dollar and simultaneously cut demand for primary commodities. This represented a double whammy for developing countries. For the majority of developing countries dependent on primary commodities for their export earnings, the sharp decline in the value of their exports meant that they had to borrow more to finance their imports. At the same time, the cost of borrowing increased in two ways. First, they were paying higher rates of interest because interest rates were ultimately tied to the interest rates of the United States, meaning that Volcker's decision immediately raised the cost of repayment for all countries. Second, developing countries' loans were priced in US dollars. As a result, developing countries had to export more even to maintain the same level of their loan repayments. The net effect was a realization that countries could indeed go bankrupt. From there, the wells opened. In mid-1982, Mexico and Argentina announced they could no longer service their national debt. By the end of the year, 40 countries were in arrears. A year later, 27 countries, including Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, and others, were negotiating to restructure their debt. There was considerable debate over who was ultimately responsible for the crisis. The lenders blamed the borrowers, asserting that they had been engaged in excessive and unnecessary borrowing and had used the money irresponsibly, often going to corrupt officials rather than for the intended development program. At the same time, the borrowers argued that the lenders bore some responsibility as well. They had engaged in lending practices without taking account of risk, had lent too much money to some governments, and had not done the appropriate investigation or oversight of the money they were lending. As in most cases, the truth probably falls somewhere in between. Regardless of who was to blame, though, the global debt crisis represented a real crisis not just for borrowing countries at risk of default, but for the broader global economy. Indeed, had Mexico and Argentina defaulted, 7 of the 10 largest banks in the United States would have been threatened with bankruptcy. As a result, there was considerable demand for solutions to the debt crisis. In general, these solutions centered on rescheduling the debt, that is, on providing new loans with longer repayment periods and thus lower monthly payments. Thus, both the Baker Plan, outlined by Secretary of Treasury James Baker in 1983, and the Brady Plan, outlined by Secretary of Treasury Nicholas Brady in 1989, centered on the idea that new loans would be granted to repay old loans. The Baker Plan also outlined the ground rules under which loans would be restructured. The plan provided that all loans must be repaid in full. It also established that countries would be treated individually, that is, there would be no comprehensive solution to, or indeed a discussion of, a broader third world debt crisis. Additionally, any agreement on restructuring was subject to the agreement of all interested parties. In other words, the creditor, the country, and the IMF all had to agree on proposed repayments. Importantly, the process of issuing new loans fundamentally altered the nature of the debt itself. The banks had been engaged in lending money to states, and they accrued all the profits, but also took all the risks associated with those loans. If a country defaulted, the bank was out. But in issuing the new loans, the IMF took over the risk associated with that loan. The banks still made their profit, but the risk of default associated with the loans was transferred to the public. Equally importantly, the Baker Plan expanded the role of the International Monetary Fund in the global development. Before the debt crisis, the IMF was the lender of last resort. Countries would go to the IMF if they could not get access to credit elsewhere. After the debt crisis, the IMF became the seal of approval all developing countries needed to secure private credit. Because lenders could not be guaranteed a repayment if loans were not certified by the IMF, all private creditors started requiring IMF approval before they would lend money. The IMF thus became the arbiter of creditworthiness in the global economy, and securing the IMF's approval often required countries undertake some pretty serious fundamental reforms of their economy, collectively referred to as structural adjustment. Even after the Baker and Brady plans, total third world debt continued to increase. In constant 1995 dollars, total third world debt stood at just under $1 trillion when the crisis broke, but by 2000, it was approximately $2.5 trillion. And this debt had real impact on developing countries. In Mali, for example, total foreign external debt stood at $2.8 billion in 2012. Yet the country had a GDP per capita of just $900. But Mali spends 4% of its total GDP on debt repayments, compared to just 3% on public health and 2% on education. And Mali is not alone. As this graphic illustrates, between 1970 and 2002, Africa collectively received about $525 billion in loans and made approximately $540 billion in repayments. Yet it still owes almost $300 billion as a result of debt restructuring. It's not dissimilar from making the minimum monthly payments on your credit cards. You'll eventually wind up paying it off, but you'll pay a lot of interest and service fees along the way. A variety of organizations have campaigned to forgive third world debt. Many argue that the debt is unsustainable, that it can never actually really be repaid. In 1996, the IMF launched the HIPC, or Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. This initiative essentially promised debt relief for countries that agreed to undertake structural adjustment-like reforms. Then in 2004, something interesting happened. The United States pressured Iraqi creditors, primarily France, Germany, and Russia, to forgive Iraqi debt. The U.S. asserted that Iraqi debt was illegitimate under the odious debt doctrine, which holds that debt that was acquired without the consent of the people, for example by a military dictatorship, and was not used for the benefit of the people, is illegitimate, and creditors should forgive such foreign debt. Anti-debt campaigners jumped on the bandwagon. Further, they argued that if Iraq qualified for debt forgiveness under the odious debt doctrine, then certainly countries like South Africa, where the apartheid-era government financed its military and police forces to repress the black majority, should also be forgiven. And what about the Philippines, where Ferdinand Marcos accumulated $10 billion in personal wealth while the national debt grew to $28 billion? And Zaire, in Indonesia, and Nicaragua, and Nigeria, and countless others would also certainly qualify. But this question, so far at least, remains unanswered.